And I think that it is inspired by that term. So when I think of these different things, right? Jailbreaking is a technique by which you construct an adversarial input, adversarial in the adversarial ML sense, where it's structured in a certain way that kind of manipulates the model into doing things that its system instructions or safety tuning would otherwise not normally permit. But at the end of the day, so like we're going to get just we're going to vaguely approach the PhD level conversation, right? There was this paper that came out, Fundamental Limitations of Large Language Model Alignment by Wolf et al. And essentially what the paper showed is that there always exists. It doesn't say how hard it is to find. It doesn't say that it's easy to find. It doesn't say that it's feasible in the lifetime of the universe, although it probably is because it's finite mostly. It's finite, but really big. But there always exists some input such that if you have a desired output subject to like context lengths and, generation lengths, right? There always exists some input that will generate whatever output you want. So essentially it proves no matter what you do, because these things are just probability distributions over tokens, there always exists the ability to get whatever you want out of the model. So,
And that's not true with applications then, right? Because applications are they're kind of limited, right?
in general, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, applications are generally going to be more limited. But what happens with jailbreaking and kind of the security implications of it is that you might assume that your LLM is well behaved, but because it can always potentially, right? It is always possible. It may not be feasible, it may not be likely, but it's always possible that your LLM will output whatever the worst thing you can imagine for your use case is. You kind of need to control for that. And in traditional applications, we have really nice computational properties, right? Like we're still subject to like the halting problem and Rice's theorem and all of these other, things that people learned in undergrad and then immediately forgot about. But, we're still subject to these constraints. But for the most part, like you can get pretty far with like a regex. You can get pretty far with like a fuzzy hash,
Yeah.
And that's because code is inherently somewhat constrained, right? Like you can do anything a Turing machine can do, which is a lot, but it's not everything ever. It is fundamentally bounded in certain ways. But if we think about, and I'm sorry for going way, way into the theoretical CS weeds here, but if we think about like the Chomsky hierarchy, right, where you have like your regular languages and then you have your context-free languages and, natural languages like English or Chinese or French or Spanish or whatever, natural languages are outside of the Chomsky hierarchy, which means that they are fundamentally beyond the possible limits of computation, which is great for us because if we could only speak in ways that were computable, poetry wouldn't exist. It would be very boring. But, it also makes it really hard to put security controls around the output, which is why I think security is actually, in some ways, a marginally easier problem than content safety, right? Like, I don't know what text is going to hurt your feelings. I don't know what text is going to be psychologically harmful to you, right? I don't know how many hours you spent on slash B in 2007, right? Like, we all have different tolerances for these things, and these things are normative, right? They change over time. An LLM trained in the 1860s wouldn't have the same norms and expectations as one trained in 2025. So all of that is to say, that is a giant and very difficult and very fuzzy problem. But when we try and bring it back down to cybersecurity, right? Things like, okay, this LLM generated some output and I'm going to send that output to a SQL server. Okay, well, what checks would you do before you sent user input to that SQL server? Do those same ones, right? Treat your language model as if it is a user. And I think that, at the very beginning, right, to kind of loop all the way back, right, that zero trust model, why are we treating language models as a trusted component of the system? At the end of the day, they take text that may be from the internet, that may be from a user, that may be from some other service, interpret it probabilistically, and generate some kind of output based on that. And I don't know. I don't trust that. I wouldn't trust that. So like, why are people piping this into bash. Like, don't do that. What would you do before a user had their text piped into bash? And if you wouldn't pipe a user's text into bash, maybe a language model shouldn't do it either. And I think that that's something that is going to be difficult for people to adopt, right? We see that people are really running full speed ahead at this stuff, but eventually somebody will get breached and it's going to cost them like $1 billion. And then maybe, myself and people like Rich Harang can stop thinking of ourselves as Cassandras.
So, so Eric, the big talk right now is that AI is just going to offset everyone's job in 5 years. Everyone's going to lose their job, basically. And I think that in some industries, that might be true to some extent, right? But I think for the vast majority, especially in security, and I think that you have the same mentality, is that it's just going to augment us. It'll make us, 10x better. It'll 10x your already existing headcount, right? And I think that that's also how NVIDIA overall views it. I actually heard, the CEO on an interview last week where he said companies are thinking, oh, I can buy this AI and I can get rid of all these people. He's like, how they should be thinking is, I'm going to buy this AI and I'm going to take these 10 people, turn them into 100, and we're going to grow the company, right? Like,
Mhm.
which makes a whole lot more sense than people just like losing their jobs.
So,
So with that being said, are there still risks for people in security with AI and LLMs in that perspective? And what skills would you recommend people to gain now to kind of prepare for the future so that they're not completely like caught off balance?
yeah, okay. Yeah, that's good. Thank you for the easy question. So I think there's a couple of things at play here. I think the first thing is, as we know from infinite experience, right? Just because it's a bad business decision doesn't mean that people aren't going to do it, right? People are going to do what they think. So if a decision maker at a company, right? If your CISO says, well, this vendor told me that this will 10x my capacity so I can lay off 90% of my staff. Like, well, unfortunately, that's just a person who's going to have a lot of regrets and is probably also going to be looking for a job soon. So it's not foolproof. I would also say I think a lot of the claims, right? Like I see something again as a security person, I think we come at a lot of stuff with a sense of skepticism. And so when I hear somebody say, well, this will 10x your productivity, I'm like, okay, that means two. That means two math, right? And anything else is gravy. And I think one of the things that I've found so fascinating with the AI hype is that so many people, right, once it broke containment, just believed it uncritically. Where they're like, yeah, it'll make you 10 times faster. I'm like, when have you ever gotten a product that made you 10 times more anything?
Yeah.
So like still do your evaluations, have your sense of skepticism, really try and figure it out. I think that for people who are maybe a little anxious about these things, because at the end of the day, no matter how much you believe that, if your boss's boss doesn't believe it, unfortunately, it's not up to you. Right? Very few people choose to get laid off. So I think the skills that are really important may or may not be counterintuitive, but I think that there are significant benefits both to being an extreme generalist, right? I think that there's a lot of value there in being able to be cross-functional, being able to be collaborative, and then maybe you use your, more experienced coworkers or you use AI tools, right? To do the parts that are maybe a little bit beyond your reach in that domain.